Hmm. Uh, huh?
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, featuring your hosts, Taylor Field and Reuben Olson.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of Cryptid Clues. I am your host, Taylor Field, and today we got a great, interesting little topic we're going to dive into. But before we get into that, just a couple of plugs. You can find us on our website, CryptidClues.ca, social media channels, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Cryptid Clues, and you can also find us on Patreon, where you can get ad-free early episodes. Additionally, you can send us an email. Just say hi, just check in, cryptidclues@gmail.com. And that's pretty much it. So without further ado, we're going to get into the Mongolian Death Worm today. Now, Reuben wishes he could join us with this episode, and he did prepare some notes. He was getting ready to, but it's hard to kind of book a day and to schedule and just kind of line everything up. So I thought I've managed to find a little bit more information than he was able to. And I thought, Reuben, it's okay. Like, let me just get at this and we'll reconvene for the next episode. Next episode, we're going to be diving into giants, and we're going to kind of talk about a little bit about the whole Afghanistan debacle that people talked about before, and just giants in general in the world. But that'll be highlight for next week. But we're on worms right now, so I just thought something like this. Well, I shouldn't say I thought something like this was only limited to video games and movies, because as we're learning about this whole cryptid adventure, that there seems to be many different types and varieties of cryptids and unbelievable, inexplainable things that have popped up in our history. And this is one of those things. So when I was looking into the Mongolian Death Worm, I found that, okay, it resides in the more remote parts of the Gobi Desert. And it first became actually well known in Western society in 1926. This is actually via a book called On the Trail of Ancient Man by a paleontologist called Chapman Andrews. So a little bit of backstory on Roy Chapman. He was an American explorer, adventurer, and naturalist who actually became the director for the American Museum of Natural History. He led many expeditions throughout China in the early 20th century into the Gobi Desert and Mongolia. These expeditions resulted in important discoveries and actually the first dinosaur egg fossils that were put into museums. I read through some of his book from what I could properly decipher. He has a lot of interesting information looking into dinosaurs and certain groups of humans that lived in parts of the Gobi Desert and stuff like that, and just really kind of getting the lay of the land and looking into the history of those areas. It is really interesting stuff. And this man, he was very active, and I found this was interesting. Someone had related him to Indiana Jones almost, but again, there's no confirmation that Indiana Jones is based off of this individual whatsoever. But he was very prominent in the field, very outgoing, and very just, he wanted to know, he wanted to learn these things. And he made several major contributions to, again, museums and just our history and discovery, especially in dinosaur areas as well. However, in this book, though, it's described. Now, I took a passage here. So, quote unquote, I'm going to read specifically this part of the book, and yeah, we'll go from there. Then the premier asked that, if it were possible, I should capture for the Mongolian government a specimen of the Alagorhai horhai. I doubt whether any of my scientific readers can identify this animal. I could, because I had heard of it often. None of those present ever had seen the creature, but they all firmly believed in its existence and described it minutely. It is shaped like a sausage, about 2 feet long. It has no head nor legs, and is so poisonous that merely a touch to it means instant death. It lives in the most desolate parts of the Gobi Desert, whither we were going. To the Mongols, it seems to be what the dragon is to the Chinese. The premier said that, although he had never seen it himself, he knew a man who had, and had lived to tell the tale. Then a cabinet minister stated that the cousin of his late wife's sister had also seen it. I promised to produce the Alagorha High if we chanced to cross its path, and explained how it could be seized by means of long steel collecting forceps. Moreover, I could wear dark glasses so that the disastrous effects of even looking at so poisonous a creature would be neutralized. Again, that is, end quote, pulled from the book On the Trail of Ancient Man. That was the only mention of this that I could actually find in this book. And I scoured through it as in-depthly as I feel like I could. But it's worth, again, noting that's 1926. That's when this first made its kind of debut into Western society. Roy himself did not actually believe in this creature's existence. He went along with the local kind of belief and the political government's, I shouldn't say political, the government's request to capture one of these things. He did not believe it was real. So I personally, I find that kind of interesting, but again, he was polite. He wasn't disrespecting or being rude to them, but like if by chance something like this did exist and he did happen to come across it, he was contingent and he had delivered the means of how if he would proceed to actually capture such a thing. Long steel collecting forceps, something of an apparatus to actually contain and grab it makes sense. If you can't touch it, it's poisonous skin. I mean, I think it's very commendable how he actually formulated this plan to actually pursue such a thing, if it should arrive. So, roughly the size of an intestine, with a blood-like color to it, and spike-like projections at both ends. No distinguishable eyes, nose, or mouth. The mouth, however, is a factor that is surprisingly actually disputed quite often. Some claim it has an open mouth with rows of sharp inward pointing teeth. And it's usually spending its time hiding under the sand, and when spotted, it wastes no time in just quickly burying itself to conceal. It travels underground and can be spotted by waves of sand that appear on the surface of the desert when it passes. Additionally, it's rumored to hibernate for 10 months out of the year, waking up in June and July with a taste for camels. They supposedly leave eggs inside the animal's intestines, and in folklore, they say that these worms have the ability to actually spit out a corrosive saliva rumored to generate actually electrical shocks. There's been numerous organized expeditions that have taken place to find this cryptid, but despite extensive searches, interviews, and traps, everything has actually come back empty-handed. It's also worth noting the descriptions, which are for the most part second and third hand stories, are from different areas and times, but remain similar in comparison. But this cryptid seems to be more fueled by folklore and legend than to be based on anything recent and concrete, I would say. So what could it be? I got a few different options and explanations possibly, but before we get into that, I'm just going to jump to a quick ad break and then we'll be right back. And we're back. So many explanations have been presented for this cryptid, including a misidentified or undiscovered species of snake, worm, lizard, sand boa snake. Those are two other possible suggestions. However, to sustain such a population, you need a few thousand, possibly up to 10,000. I'm the kind of person myself that believes North America is huge. There is a lot of free roaming space and vacancy for a few thousand, 10,000 Sasquatch to be running around. No doubt in my mind. So the Gobi Desert, however, we're looking at a landscape that is not really ideal for anything to necessarily reside in. The climate is extreme. The temperatures are falling as low as minus 30 degrees in the winter, that's the Celsius, mind you, and reaching as high as 38 degrees Celsius in the summer. Now again, that doesn't mean anything can't survive there. Camels are a great example, actually, of having evolved to their surroundings. And this is an interesting fact, actually. Camels can actually close their nasal passages to prevent dust and sand from blasting up there, during sandstorms. I didn't realize that, and it's fantastic. Even their humps allow them to produce, to a degree, a little bit of water to stay hydrated. The Gobi Desert itself, however, it spans 1,500 kilometers. That is over 1,000 miles. So the idea that many undiscovered species exist, well suited to their environment, I should say, is very likely. Not ideal, but suited. Kind of another comparison I've made, and this is kind of my case argument when I talk to people about aliens. We go out thinking, okay, we need to find that Goldilocks zone planet. We need to find something that has the right conditions for what we consider the right kind of qualifications. I don't know if qualifications is the right word. The right components to contain and support life. Look at the different elements like oxygen and things off of the periodic table and chemicals and imbalances that can help sustain and hold life. That's not the case everywhere. We have grown to adapt to this planet alongside every other animal on this planet, and we have evolved from the elements that this planet has provided us. So if you go out into the stars and you find a planet made out of lava and brimstone, sulfur out the wazoo, you could find very well a species that lives and inhales sulfur to survive. That's one of its things, but it's not something we necessarily might run with. That's just a poor example. But that's kind of my comparison. You look at the Gobi Desert. There is definitely a possibility that something could evolve to sustain itself in such a harsh environment. A couple other interesting little facts here. The worms in Tremors were based on death worms. If you've seen Tremors, good. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. Now, you don't have to watch all of them. There's some recent ones now, like 7 or 8 of them, but you don't have to watch those. I'd say watch like the first 3. The first 3 are pretty cool. In the video game Ark Survival Evolved, they added a death worm as part of the Scorched Earth DLC. A couple other things too. Dune also features a giant sandworm, and another form represented is actually in Star Wars The Mandalorian. I know it's called a crate dragon, but I'd say it's very kind of similar in sense of what we're kind of disclosing here. But it seems like sandworms are very much a popular icon in film and video game kind of stuff like that. But I just found this to be very interesting. This was, again, something I discovered that I really wanted to talk about, just because it's a very realistic thing that could exist. I'm one that believes in many, many tunnels out there that kind of interconnect, and cryptids can use these tunnels to get from point A to point B. And then now you're talking about a worm, you're dealing with something that makes its own tunnels. I was very curious, even more so, that I had to look into prehistoric worms. There was an age on this planet where things were just huge. They were gigantic. So looking into gigantic cryptids from the past, this one, it's not necessarily, this one, okay, going into here, this one is not from the past. This one is actually still prominent today. It is of South Africa. And it's called a Microchaetus ripi. It is a heckin' long worm. Oh my goodness. I pulled up photos of it. This thing is long. And in 1967, there was a giant specimen that actually was found. It came in at 21 feet in length. And that's when, it was naturally extended. And 20 millimeters, that is almost an inch in diameter. This was found on the road between Alice and King Williamstown, actually. So that is huge. And actually, I believe it was in the Guinness World Records. So these worms, they can get massive. Now, if we look again back in the past, way far back in the past, we're talking 400 million years ago. There is something that it wasn't necessarily confirmed right away what this was, but this is basically the largest marine jawed worm ever found. It was discovered in sedimentary rock from Canada. These animals, now again, we know worms are very often small, between a few centimeters and decimeters, but the fossil of this entity indicates that it was, again, very large. Its body coming in around 1 to 2 meters long. That is 6.5 feet roughly. That is insane. So the only thing left of this animal, which they were able to find, was the jaw, which is much larger compared to similar fossils. So researchers between Canada and England, they kind of figured out, okay, there's this fossil, and we're going to kind of like dive into this and see what's going on. And after kind of going at it a little bit more, they were able to name this species Websteroprion armstrongi, and that it lived in the ocean. They weren't able to decipher what exactly it was eating. Considering its jaws, researchers actually suspect that this was more like a predator-scavenger kind of entity. So one big thing, again, with this, I mentioned it earlier, they call it gigantism, that's the way you say it. It existed as early as 400 million years ago. And that's I know it's far off, but not super, super far off. We're kind of looking at, if you want like a visual comparison, think Peter Jackson's King Kong, where you have the human survivors fall into that trench and they have to deal with the giant insects and everything like that, and the worms and everything. Just disgusting, but there's a visual for you. So looking into the studies that these researchers made, this phenomenon of gigantism, seems to be limited to a certain evolutionary branch among jawed worms. A several 100 million-year-old worm. This adds so much information to, again, the animal life on Earth in the past and how evolution works and the process of it. So these giant worms have existed in the past. Could some have adapted and changed? Obviously, the Gobi Desert wasn't always a desert. So there's no telling, like perhaps maybe there was a different, what would be the term for that? Like a different kind of natural body, I guess you could say, environment. I'm sure you know what I'm trying to say. Very different when you transcend over millions of years. Sometimes these animals may not leave their natural habitats and they're going to adapt. I know on a previous episode, I was talking to Reuben about pale walkers, for example. I did a Campfire Clues episode about this too, where you're dealing with certain species that they branch off from the linear path of their current evolutionary trend or track, and they space out, they separate out, and they go down an alternate path, and it branches out into a new distinct group that we may not have discovered yet. It could be the same thing I talked about with aquatic humanoids, where there could be a branch of ancestral humanoid that's going along, and then all of a sudden some of them decide to go into the water, and then boom, let's jump ahead a few thousand years, few hundred years, whatever you want to call it, and we've got a different branch of humanoid species on the planet. I think it's the same thing for worms. I really do. Your worms have come this far and they've survived, and that's something when you deal with the dinosaurs and meteors smashing the earth and everything like that. The things that were buried deep in the ground are the things that survived. And sure enough, while we may not be able to actually see these things, there's no doubt in my mind that there are things under the ground, even in the Gobi Desert. But at some point, sooner or later, you're going to find some evidence. And unless it's being covered up, I'll never really know. But if you look at Roy, again, he was a famous man that he didn't believe in the existence of it. And he spent a lot of time, dedicated his practice to studying Mongolia, Gobi Desert, the animals, the fossils, the history, and the people in these areas. And he was not able to find something. So that is something that kind of makes me stem more on the side of these things probably aren't a reality. And then you have to look at the dynamic of, okay, you have people from different times, people from different areas, no internet, but they're all telling the same thing. And that's something that always kind of pulls me back into this a little bit, thinking, oh, well, what's really going on here? Like, how are these people? Is it just folklore? Is it just, again, the legend that's just been transcending down generation to generation and just kind of fueling this and continues it on? I don't know myself, but someday I do hope to be able to find out. Again, I know Reuben, he wanted to be on this episode, but just couldn't get the scheduling to work out. But it's something that I'm going to keep talking to him about. He got a chuckle out of it when he was like, oh, you know, Dune and Star Wars and all that jazz. And it's crazy how such a thing has actually kind of come forward in life and these different representations. But that is all I got on the Mongolian Death Worm of the Gobi Desert. So I hope this was very informative. I found it to be very enlightening. To get into the research for something like this is very cool. And I do highly recommend Roy Chapman Andrews' book, On the Trail of Ancient Man. It's really not that long of a read. And if you get through it, it just talks about a lot of very interesting things about that part of the world and a lot of the interesting discoveries that they made. And again, there are some parts which are a little bit more for an adult side, not necessarily a super young mind, but it is very much an interesting learning experience to read it. So I definitely highly recommend it. I'm definitely going to pinpoint Reuben into trying to dive into it and see what he thinks of it too, because we're both avid dinosaur fans, so it's kind of a cool time. But yeah, that is all I got, ladies and gentlemen. So again, thank you for tuning into this episode of Cryptid Clues. Just like I said at the beginning, the plugs, you can find us CryptidClues.ca. You can tune in to our social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. You can find us on Patreon, get ad-free exclusive episodes there, and you can also find us in the email. Send us an email, say hello, message, whatever you like, cryptidclues@gmail.com. And that's it. So until next time, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.